He picked up my mother's suitcase and said, "That old thing is junk, Odette. Your family never had anything." He moved it to the garage. I let him. 1 week later, I went out to the garage alone and opened it, and found, stitched into the lining, an envelope with a land trust document inside, naming me as the final beneficiary of 240 acres of Pima County desert, worth $3.2 million. I had surveyed that land 3 years ago. I had written the section and township in my field notes and moved on, because it wasn't my job to wonder who owned it. It was, it turned out, my grandmother's job to tell me. Good day, dear listeners. It's Lena again, and I'm so glad you're here with me today. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tap the like button. It helps these stories reach the people who need them. And tell me in the comments which city you're listening from. I love seeing just how far these stories travel. People always say that families who have nothing leave nothing. What I have learned is that they sometimes leave everything, hidden so carefully that only the person who was meant to find it could find it, and only at the right moment. My grandmother was a practical woman. She hid the trust in the place she was most certain I would eventually look, inside a suitcase with her initials on the tag, left to my mother, who left it to me, waiting for the moment when I was patient enough to open it. My name is Odette Fairfax, and I am a licensed land surveyor. I have worked for a Tucson engineering firm for 25 years, mapping boundaries and assessing parcel configurations for development permits. I know the Pima County desert the way most people know their own neighborhood, by coordinates, by section and township, by the particular texture of the survey data for different parts of the county. The desert in bloom is a fact I work in and around, not a backdrop. The saguaro, the creosote, the old section markers in rust orange iron. I know where they are. I have known for 25 years. What I did not know is that 240 acres of it had been waiting for me since before I was born. I was 51 years old when my mother died. She left behind a small apartment, a modest estate, and a battered brown leather suitcase with brass clasps and a faded initials tag. OMF, my grandmother's initials. Odette May Fairfax, whose name I carry. The suitcase was in the living room when I arrived to begin settling things. Dominic, my husband, had come with me to help. He had been helpful in the practical ways, carrying boxes, directing donation runs, managing the logistics of emptying a space. He picked up the suitcase, looked at the faded initials tag and said, "That old thing is junk, Odette. Your family never had anything. We don't need to keep it." He moved it to the garage shelf before I could respond. I did not argue. I had learned, in 23 years of marriage, when to argue and when to wait. I waited 1 week. Tucson in late spring is a particular kind of heat. The desert in bloom, the saguaro enormous in the early light, the air after a brief night rain carrying the smell of creosote for hours afterward. The garage behind our Sam Hughes bungalow was dry and low-ceilinged, smelling of stored heat and rubber. The suitcase sat on the shelf between paint cans and a folded camp chair. I moved the camp chair, moved the paint cans, and lifted the suitcase down. It was heavier than it looked. Leather, age, the specific weight of accumulated time. Among my mother's papers, I had found a folded note 3 days after the funeral, my grandmother's handwriting on a piece of stationery. The case holds what you need. I had set it aside during the initial sorting and lost track of it in the volume of things to process. I found it again the day before I went to the garage, in a stack of cards I had been putting off reading. When I read it, I understood what I needed to do. The clasps on the suitcase were stiff. The inside smelled of cedar and something older, the smell of a space sealed for a long time. The lining was a faded blue silk, hand-sewn in the way of someone who sewed carefully and expected the work to last. I ran my hands along the bottom edge and found it, a straight stitching line that did not match the lining's original pattern, a hidden seam. I pulled it apart carefully, following the line with my thumbnail. Inside was an unsealed envelope, folded once. I took it to the overhead light and opened it. Section 14, Township 16 South, Range 12 East, Gila and Salt River Meridian, Pima County, Arizona. I had written those coordinates in my field book 3 years earlier. I had been surveying a county road project past a clean 240-acre parcel and had noted it as no active permits, owner unlisted in current county records. I had moved on. Surveyors map the present. We are trained not to speculate about the past. I had not speculated. I had simply moved on. The parcel had stayed in the records as unattributed, uncontested, and unexamined until the moment I sat on the garage floor, holding the 1987 land trust document, and read the legal description 3 times. My grandmother had purchased the 240 acres in 1962. $800 for 240 acres of Pima County desert, the kind of purchase that was possible before anyone understood what that land would become. She had held it in a land trust, a legal structure common in Arizona at the time, naming herself as trustee. The 1987 document was a trust amendment, naming my mother as successor beneficiary and me as the final beneficiary upon my mother's death. The succession was unambiguous. The chain was clear. The trust had simply never been re-recorded after my mother's death, a common failure with informal family trusts from that era. But Cressida Howell, the Tucson probate attorney I called from the garage floor, confirmed within 24 hours that re-recording was possible and straightforward. I sat on the concrete for a long time after reading the document. The overhead light buzzed faintly. The paint cans were still on the floor beside me. I looked at the legal description again. Section 14, Township 16 South, Range 12 East. The parcel I had noted in my field book 3 years ago, and then set aside because it was not mine to examine. It had been mine. It had always been mine. My grandmother had known this. She had placed the document in the suitcase and sealed the seam and waited for the right person to find it. Cressida Howell had handled 2 similar cases, mid-century Arizona land trusts with informal succession chains, and she knew the territory. She asked me to bring the document to her office the following morning. I did. She reviewed it for 2 hours and called me that afternoon. It's valid. The re-recording will take 30 days. You'll be on title in 6 weeks. I went home and set the trust document on the kitchen table. Dominic was in the kitchen when I returned. He looked at the document the way he had looked at the suitcase, with the composed confidence of a man who has assessed a situation and found it unremarkable. I opened the trust document to the legal description. I read it aloud. Section 14, Township 16 South, Range 12 East. I told him what it was. I told him the Pima County assessed value, $3.2 million. He looked at the document. He looked at me. He said, "Your family never had." And then he stopped, because I had laid my field notebook on the table, open to the survey page from 3 years earlier, and the coordinates matched exactly. Stuart, Dominic's brother, was at the kitchen counter. He had arrived for dinner 10 minutes earlier and said nothing. Dominic looked at the coordinates. He looked at the document. He looked at the table. He looked away. There was nothing left to say about what my family had or didn't have. Cressida filed the re-recording paperwork within the week. The Pima County Recorder's Office processed it in 28 days. The 240-acre parcel transferred to my name on a Thursday morning in June. Cressida called me to confirm. I thanked her and hung up and sat at my desk at the engineering firm for a moment, looking at the USGS map of Pima County I keep framed on the wall. Section 14 is in the lower left quadrant of the map, an area I had surveyed twice in 25 years and had always understood as straightforward, uncomplicated desert. Now I understood it as mine. I drove out to the land on a Saturday morning in June, in the early light before the heat arrived. The county road approach was familiar. I had driven it for a survey project 3 years earlier and had noted the parcel in passing. Now, I turned off the paved road onto the dirt track that marked the south boundary and drove until I found the first section marker. An iron stake, rust orange against the sand, placed decades ago by a survey crew whose paperwork was in a Pima County archive somewhere. I stood beside the marker for a long time. The desert was entirely still. The saguaro stood in the early light in the particular posture that I had always thought of as patient, that combination of height and stillness and rootedness that makes them look like something that has been waiting a long time for someone to arrive. My grandmother had stood somewhere on this land in 1962 and had paid $800 for it, and she had known, without being able to say why, that it mattered. She had been right by $3.2 million and 1 granddaughter. I drove home and put the suitcase on the shelf in my office at the engineering firm, between a survey tripod and the framed USGS map. It sits there now. It looks exactly like what it is, the thing that held everything. Arizona law was clear. Inherited separate property is not community property, regardless of when it arrives during a marriage. Dominic had no claim on the land. Cressida had confirmed this in our first conversation. The land was mine, separate, recorded, unambiguous, the same way my grandmother had always intended it to be. Dominic and I have had several conversations since the kitchen table evening about the marriage and about what it is and what it has been. Those conversations are their own story. What I will tell you is that the land is mine, and that my grandmother was right to put it where she put it. The things your family leaves you are not always easy to find, but the people who loved you most were careful about where they hid them. Pay attention to what has been overlooked. Now tell me, if you found something like this in a relative's belongings, something no one had told you existed, what would you have done in the first hour? Tell me in the comments. Share this story. Thank you for being here. Let me tell you more about my grandmother, dear listeners, and about the land, because they are inseparable. Odette May Fairfax was a practical woman from a practical family. She had grown up in Nogales, on the Arizona-Mexico border, in a household where money was managed carefully because there was never enough of it to manage carelessly. She had moved to Tucson in her 30s, had worked as a seamstress and then as a dry goods clerk, and then as a bookkeeper for a small construction company, and had accumulated what she accumulated by spending nothing she did not have to spend. In 1962, she had purchased 240 acres of Pima County desert from a rancher who had given up on it. Land that was too far from water for cattle, too far from town for development, too flat for anything the rancher had been able to imagine. He had sold it for $800 and been glad to be rid of it. My grandmother had known something he had not. Not about the land's future value, she could not have known that. She had simply understood, in the practical way of someone who has never had enough, that owning land is different from having money. Money can be spent. Land remains. She had put the land in a trust and had maintained it patiently for 25 years, paying the property taxes from her bookkeeping income, watching the county's assessed value rise slowly, and then, in the 1990s and 2000s, quickly, until the 240 acres that had cost her $800 was worth more than she had earned in her entire professional life. She had not told anyone about it, not my mother, not my aunts, not her neighbors. She had maintained the trust documentation in a bank safety deposit box for 15 years and had then, in 1987, moved it to the suitcase because she had decided, by then, that banks were no more permanent than anything else, and that the right place for a document is where the right person will find it. She had stitched the envelope into the lining herself. The stitching was clean and tight, the work of someone who knew how to sew and had chosen to sew carefully. I have not unpicked the remainder of the seam. It is still there, along the bottom edge of the lining. Every time I open the suitcase, which is to say, every time I look at it on the shelf in my office, I see the edge of the seam. It is the most physical evidence I have of my grandmother's patience. The 1987 amendment was the document that named me. My mother had been named in the original trust instrument as successor beneficiary. The amendment updated that designation to name my mother and, upon my mother's death, me. My grandmother had drafted it herself, in the specific language of Arizona land trust law that she had researched at the Tucson Library, and had had it notarized at the same bank branch where she had kept the original documents for 15 years. She had done this in 1987, when I was 11 years old. She had looked at me at 11 and decided I was the right person to hold this land. I do not know exactly what she saw. I know what she decided. The Pima County assessor's most recent valuation of the 240-acre parcel, $3.2 million. The parcel is classified as rural desert land with no current development permits, no active use, and no recorded encumbrances. It is exactly as my grandmother left it. Clean, quiet, patient. I am not planning to develop it. I have considered leasing it for conservation purposes and am in preliminary conversations with a land trust organization. I am in no hurry. My grandmother held this land for 40 years. I can afford to take my time. Dominic had been dismissive of my family's history in a way that was not malicious. That is important to understand. He was not a cruel man. He had grown up in a family with professional credentials and institutional weight, and he had developed, in that environment, the particular blind spot of someone who equates documentation of achievement with achievement itself. My family's history was undocumented by his standards. Working class, mixed heritage, no professional credentials beyond the practical. He had interpreted the lack of documentation as evidence of absence. He had been wrong. My grandmother's record was precise and clean, and had simply been in a suitcase rather than a filing cabinet. The distinction is one of format, not of substance. I have said nothing to Dominic about the irony of a land surveyor not knowing she owned a parcel she had surveyed. He has not raised it either. We both understand the irony without discussing it. That is the nature of a marriage after 23 years. There are things you understand together without needing to say them. The field notebook from the survey project 3 years ago is in the archive room at the firm, where I keep all completed survey files. Page 47 has the note, Section 14, Township 16 South, Range 12 East, 240 acres, no active permits, owner unlisted in current county records, clean parcel, note for reference. The note for reference turned out to be more relevant than I had imagined when I wrote it. That is the thing about field notes. You write them for the project, and sometimes they turn out to be for something else entirely. The suitcase, the legal description, the rust-orange iron markers on the south boundary of my land, these are the signature objects of my grandmother's patience and my inheritance. I will tell you one more thing about the land. On the Saturday morning I drove out to it for the first time as its owner. I stood at the south boundary marker for a long time in the early light. The desert was still. The saguaro were enormous in that light, older than I am, most of them, possibly older than my grandmother would have been. They were already standing when she walked this land in 1962 and decided it was worth $800. They are still standing. Land does that. People come and go, and land stands. I looked at the marker. I took a GPS reading, which is habit for a surveyor. I wrote the coordinates in my field book. I drove home. Tell me in the comments what you would have done with the land, dear listeners. I am genuinely curious. Drop your city. Share this story tonight. Thank you for listening. There are a few more things I want to tell you, dear listeners, about the weeks after Cressida filed and before the re-recording was confirmed. I continued working through all of it. I had a survey project that month on the north side of Tucson, a commercial corridor development, parcel boundary verification, the kind of work I have done hundreds of times. I did the work with my usual attention. I drove the roads, I found the markers. I wrote the coordinates in my field book. On 2 of the 3 field days I was aware, in a compartmentalized way, that somewhere in the Pima County recorder's office, a clerk was processing the paperwork that would transfer my grandmother's trust into my name. I did not think about it while I was working. Surveyors are trained to be where they are. I was on those roads. I was doing that work. The other thing was in process and would complete itself when it completed itself. Cressida kept me updated by email. The process was straightforward. She had been right about that. The trust document was unambiguous. The succession instrument was valid. The chain was clean. The county's recording office had seen similar instruments before, though not recently. A land trust from 1962 with a 1987 amendment is an older structure, but it is a recognized one. The recording clerk had to pull a reference manual for the format. That was the most complicated thing about the process. I want to tell you about Cressida's reaction when she first reviewed the document, because it was the kind of reaction that professional attorneys rarely allow themselves to perform. She had been reviewing my grandmother's instrument for about an hour when she called me. She said, "This is one of the cleanest informal trust instruments I have seen from that era." She said it with the restrained approval of someone who has seen a great many informal trust instruments from that era and found most of them to be significantly less clean. I thanked her. She said, "Your grandmother knew what she was doing." I said, "Yes, she did." That was the extent of the professional sentiment. We moved on to the filing mechanics. But I remember those 2 sentences. The Pima County Board of Supervisors has been considering rezoning in the section where my land sits for a transit corridor study. I received a notice in September about a public comment period. I attended the meeting, identified myself as the landowner of the affected parcel, and made a brief statement about my interest in conservation use for the property. The planning officer looked at me with the particular expression of someone who did not know the parcel had a registered owner. I gave him Cressida's card. He said he would follow up. He has. I have not decided what to do with the land. I have time. My grandmother had 40 years, and she did not decide anything except to hold it and to make sure it would reach the right person. I have the same patience she had, or I am learning it. The section markers are still there on the south boundary, rust orange against the sand. The saguaro are still there. Section 14, Township 16 South, Range 12 East. The coordinates are in my field book. They are in the county records. They are in the 1987 trust amendment that my grandmother sewed into a suitcase lining and left for me to find. I found it. That is the story. It is enough.